There is a ring of holes on almost every filtered cigarette sold in the last 50 years, and you have probably never noticed it. It was not put there to protect you. It was put there to fool a machine. So what does a machine's puff on a piece of lab equipment have to do with what happens inside your lungs? If you or anyone in your life ever switched to a lighter cigarette thinking it was the safer move, this is the story of why that number on the pack was never really about you. The obvious read is simple. Thinner smoke, fewer chemicals measured, a safer cigarette. That is what the label implied, and it is not what the internal science says. A federal judge would later rule this marketing fraudulent under a law usually reserved for organized crime. We're going to walk this in order. A 1960s testing machine, a trick almost embarrassingly simple once you see it, a paper trail, a lawsuit that ran for years, and a single ruling that changed what a cigarette pack in America is allowed to say. By the end, you will be able to find this exact ring of holes on a real pack and know precisely what it was engineered to do. Let's start with what this thing actually is. Picture the filter end of a cigarette, the white or cork-colored section you never really look at closely. Circle a thin band near the mouth end, and you'll find a row of tiny holes, sometimes 40 or more, each one thinner than a hair. They are called ventilation holes, and they were not stamped in with a needle. Starting in the 1960s and 70s, manufacturers used a focused laser and later a static electricity process to punch a precise ring of perforations through the filter paper. The precision mattered. Too few holes and the trick barely worked. Too many and a smoker would feel the airflow and simply avoid the brand. Engineers were tuning this to hit a specific number on a specific test, not a specific taste. Here's the part worth sitting with. This was not a filtration improvement. Standard filters had existed for years. This was something new, a hole whose entire purpose was to change what a specific measuring instrument would read. So to understand the hole, you first have to understand the instrument it was built to fool. And that instrument has a name, an origin story of its own, and it starts, oddly enough, with an actual machine that smokes. It is called the Cambridge filter method, and it was adopted by the Federal Trade Commission in 1966 as the official way to measure tar and nicotine on every cigarette sold in the United States. Let's look at exactly how that machine works, because the whole scheme depends on it. The Cambridge filter method is mechanically simple. A machine clamps a lit cigarette, then draws air through it in a fixed, standardized puff. 35 milliliters of air over 2 seconds, once every 60 seconds, until the cigarette burns down to a set length. The smoke passes through a small pad, a Cambridge filter pad, which traps the tar. Weigh the pad before and after, and you get a tar number. Analyze the trapped smoke, and you get a nicotine number. Those numbers went straight onto the pack. On paper, this sounds rigorous. A fixed puff, a fixed interval, a physical measurement. And for its narrow purpose, comparing one machine-smoked cigarette to another under identical lab conditions, it was rigorous. The problem was never the arithmetic. The problem was the assumption sitting underneath it, that a machine's fixed, gentle 35 milliliter puff, taken once a minute, resembled how an actual human being smokes a cigarette. It did not. Real smokers puff harder, more often, and inhale more deeply than the standardized test, especially when a cigarette feels or tastes weaker than the one they're used to. The machine could not adjust. A human always can. That single gap between what a fixed machine measures and what an adaptable person actually takes in is the entire space the ventilation hole was designed to live inside. Because remember what those holes do. They let extra room air into the machine's draw. Dilute the draw enough, and the machine's fixed puff pulls through less actual smoke, less tar, less nicotine, by mechanical necessity, not by any change to the tobacco itself. Here is the trick, stated plainly, because it really is this simple. Punch a ring of tiny holes near the mouth end of a filter. When the machine draws its fixed 35 milliliters, a portion of that air now comes in through the holes instead of through the tobacco. Less smoke through the tobacco means less tar lands on the collection pad. The machine, doing exactly what it was built to do, honestly reports a lower number. The test is not lying, the test is measuring a cigarette that was engineered specifically for this test. It's a bit like weighing a burger after someone has quietly cut it in half. The scale gives you an honest weight. The test itself is the dishonest part. And that lower reading is precisely what built an entire marketing category. Starting in the 1970s, brands with heavily ventilated filters were sold as light, as mild, as low tar, all resting on machine numbers that the ventilation holes had been specifically tuned to produce. To be clear about what the industry actually controlled here, nobody was faking the machine's math. They were engineering the cigarette to behave differently only in front of that one specific machine under that one specific, fixed, gentle puff. Which raises the obvious question, the one this whole video is really about. What happens when an actual human being, not a fixed piston, smokes one of these cigarettes? Because a person, unlike a machine, notices when a cigarette feels weaker. And a person, unlike a machine, can simply change how they smoke it. Here's what nobody tells you. Your body doesn't care what the machine measured. It cares about getting the dose of nicotine it has come to expect. Researchers have a name for this: compensation behavior. When a cigarette delivers less nicotine per puff, a dependent smoker's own physiology pushes them, often without any conscious decision, to draw more out of it. The National Cancer Institute laid this out in detail in Monograph 13, published in 2001, a review built substantially on decades of research by the psychologist Lynn Kozlowski into exactly how smokers adjust to lower-yield cigarettes. The compensating behaviors researchers documented were remarkably consistent and remarkably simple. Covering the ventilation holes with lips or fingers without realizing it, which blocks the dilution air and pulls the cigarette back toward a stronger draw. Taking larger puffs, taking more frequent puffs, inhaling more deeply and holding the smoke in the lungs a little longer. None of it deliberate strategy, most of it simply the body chasing a dose it had learned to expect. There is a phrase for the underlying idea that shows up again and again in the industry's own research, and it's worth hearing in plain language. Elasticity of demand for nicotine. The body will stretch its smoking behavior to keep the dose roughly constant. Put plainly, the machine's number could go down while a real person's actual tar and nicotine intake stayed roughly the same, or in some documented cases, went higher, because the person was working harder to get what their body wanted. The science existed. Which raises the harder question: who inside the industry already knew it? The answer sits in an enormous public archive most people have never heard of, the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents Library, held at the University of California, San Francisco, built from documents the companies were forced to release through the Master Settlement Agreement. Millions of pages, internal memos, research reports, marketing plans, from Philip Morris, from Brown & Williamson, from British American Tobacco, all searchable, all public, all sitting in plain sight since the late 1990s. And inside those documents, researchers working for the companies discuss compensation behavior and the elasticity of nicotine demand, not as an outside accusation, but as an internal working assumption. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The people designing the ventilation holes and the people writing the marketing claims built on top of them were working from research that already anticipated exactly why the trick would not translate into a safer cigarette. None of this means every individual scientist inside every company set out to deceive anyone. Internal research cultures are complicated, and this video isn't a character study of any one person. But the documented pattern across companies over decades is not in dispute. The regulator that had built and enforced the entire testing method was, by this point, sitting on decades of its own agency's research pointing the same direction. So what did the FTC do with what it knew? In the 1990s, the Federal Trade Commission itself began acknowledging, in its own reports and correspondence, that the Cambridge filter method produced numbers that misled consumers about actual health risk, especially once ventilated designs were common. That acknowledgement became part of a much larger case. The United States Department of Justice sued the major tobacco companies under a federal racketeering statute, RICO, in a case titled United States versus Philip Morris. In 2006, after a trial that ran for the better part of a decade, Judge Gladys Kessler of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia issued her ruling. The companies had marketed light and low-tar cigarettes as though they were less harmful, while their own research told them otherwise. In 2010, under the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, the FDA formally banned the terms light, mild, and low tar from cigarette packaging altogether. But the ruling and the ban came decades after millions of people had already made a choice based on a number that was never designed to describe them. This part deserves care, not a headline. Researchers have found that many smokers who switched to lights, believing it was a genuine step towards safety, stayed smokers longer than they otherwise might have, precisely because the switch felt like enough of a change. That is not a judgment on anyone who made that choice. It was a reasonable decision, made with a number that had been engineered specifically to earn that trust. Here's the practical part. Ventilated filters are still extremely common, even though the light and mild words are gone from the label. So here's exactly where to look. Look near the mouth end, roughly the last few millimeters of the filter, in strong side lighting. You are looking for a faint ring of tiny pinpricks circling the paper, sometimes visible as a slightly different sheen rather than a clear hole. If you can find that ring, you are looking at the exact mechanism this entire video has been about, still sitting in your hand decades after the lawsuit that exposed what it was for. None of this is unique to tobacco. It's worth naming the category this belongs to. Engineer a product to behave one way on a standardized test, and another way in the real world it's actually used, and you have built what regulators, decades later, would recognize under other names. A car company would later be caught doing something structurally similar with emissions testing, software that detected the test itself and changed how the engine behaved. Different industry, different decade, same basic move. Designed for the test, not for the world the product actually lives in. The pattern is old, and it is worth recognizing anywhere a number on a label claims to describe your real experience. So go back to that ring of holes near the mouth end of the filter. It was never a safety feature. It was a test defeat device, tuned precisely enough to lower one number on one machine, while the science inside the same companies already showed it would not lower the number that actually mattered. A machine told the truth about a cigarette built to lie to it. The gap between those two facts is the whole story, and now you know exactly where to look for it.